I've been project manager and implementation team chair since 2011. I was hired by the Grand Traverse Band in 2010. So there have been a lot of folks. The reason we actually have this project is because of collaboration between agencies. So there are the agencies that have a right to the resource, to the management and to the right to the resource. That's what actually formed the implementation team. And the implementation team consists of the Grand Traverse Band, Grand Traverse County, City of Traverse City, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Department of Natural Resources, Department of Environmental Quality, Michigan Hydro Relicensing Coalition, and Traverse City Light and Power. Then it also consists of ex officio members. They're non-voting folks that are just as important to the project as the voting members. They just don't have the specific right to the decision for the actual resource, but they help bring this project to fruition. They work with the Conservation Resource Alliance. We have the Watershed Center of Grand Traverse Bay. The list is seemingly endless. There's
Garfield Township, Road Commission,
Conservation District, Patagonia. Yeah, so there's a lot of entrepreneur Rotary Camps and Services, Traverse City. So there are a lot of folks that have been involved in this project, and that's really what gives that collaboration piece. What brought us to where we're at today. Really, that I'm trying to think of where to start out with the history. Yeah, we're going to be talking for an hour. I'm trying to truncate things here.
So essentially, the reason the dam project came about is economics. It wasn't because people were all of a sudden concerned with the ecology of Borden River, because they couldn't make money off the dams anymore. And FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, who oversees those types of projects, said Traverse City and Grand Traverse County, you need to come up with several $1 million to upgrade your hydro facilities because they are deficient and cannot pass what's it, 500-year event?
It's actually three times the 500-year event at one occurrence. So
essentially the dams couldn't safely operate under extreme high flow conditions. So it didn't take the bean counters long to realize, well, we're hardly making anything off these projects, and we're going to have to kick a bunch of money in to fix them so we can keep not making money at them. So that's kind of what precipitated, and then the ecological benefits were brought to the surface. And that's kind of what Frank and I and our organizations have been kind of pushing that message since the mid-2000s.
Yeah, but when you go all the way back to the days of logging, really in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, all the trees that you see around here were basically cut. They were rolled into the river and floated down to Traverse City, and there were a couple of mills downtown, and those logs were created, were changed into or cut into boards, and they were shipped off to construction sites, mainly Chicago. That logging industry tapered out towards the 1870s and 80s. Most of the trees that were here were cut at that time. Thomas Edison invents the light bulb somewhere in 1881. Yeah, somewhere in 1881. There's actually folks who say that there was somebody else who invented it in France before he did. Anyway, so somewhere around there, 1881, we get a light bulb. We have the concept of electricity and generating power. Hydros come, I think the first hydro dam in the United States is around 1889, 1888, 1889. In those first couple of years, thousands of hydroelectric dams went up across the country. We have over 70,000 of them in the United States right now. Over 3,000 in the state of Michigan that are over 6 feet tall, actually. They're not all hydro, but these are dams that actually segment the river system. As Nate talked about, the county and city were basically given these dams by the power companies that did not want to spend the money to upgrade, or the expense outweighed the amount of power that they would produce. I think it was a 30 to 40-year return on whatever the actual cost were, just several millions of dollars to upgrade the dams. That basically the city and county received these dams as a gift. I think something like $1 a piece, but they also assumed the responsibility for them and the upkeep and maintenance. At that point, since the dams were deficient, like Nate said, they couldn't pass the new regulations that required a certain volume of water to be passed around or through the dams, because they couldn't do that. They were non-compliant. They had to be either by the owner, which is now Grand Traverse County and Traverse City. They had to be either repaired, removed, or replaced. There are a lot of folks at that time that, I'll back up even one more, just a step a little bit more. What we're looking at here, the flow that we have today is about 105 cubic feet per second. This is a small, relatively small stream. It doesn't generate a lot of electricity. It did suit the needs of a growing city, Traverse City, in the late 1800s. It was a pretty easy resource to tap into. But these dams were somewhat below 1 megawatt, 10,100 100-watt light bulbs. So it didn't really supply the needs of current-day Traverse City. The potential for these dams, because the size of the water and the impoundments held back behind them, was not great. There certainly was the ability to continue producing hydro, but as Nate said, the costs outweighed the benefits. At that time, there were funds that came through for ecological restoration projects, especially when we fast forward to 2010, the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, through the EPA, had funds for restoration projects throughout Region 5. The Region 5 is the Great Lakes area. Those restoration projects included all kinds of reconnection of rivers and tributaries from their source to their wherever their mouths are. So what we have in this system is segregated or truncated 4 separate sections of river that are not contiguous. The 3 things, and you guys know all this, the 3 things that rivers move are: they move water, they move sediments, and they move nutrients. And some nutrients in both directions, fish moving up and down through the system. Sediments also carrying organic matter downstream, and water. Those 3 critical components were interrupted with each of the dams. The result of the process that came out of the Bourbon River Dams Committee was an implementation team to see through the decision that was made by that group over 4.5, 5 years, hundreds of community meetings and thousands of individuals, 84 different options. They were whittled down to 3, and then finally 1, which is the removal of the upper dams on the Bourbon River, the upper 3 dams, and the modification of the lowest barrier, which is Union Street. We'll be there this afternoon. Dan Zielinski, the engineer for the Fish Pass project, is going to meet us there today at 5 o'clock, so he'll be able to fill you in on that.
So Frank, one of the things I'm interested in is, when you decided to restore the river, what were some of the principles that you were using? Like, how do you know if a river is healthy? Like, what does it need? So that when these guys go home and they're looking at rivers, they can be like, oh yeah, does this river I see have the things that rivers need to be healthy?
Well, a lot of the stuff we rely on as scientists is literature. And so just a cursory review of the scientific literature related to rivers, and especially dam removal, you can parse that out even farther down to cold water rivers or warm water rivers, and that'd probably be, in my opinion, the easiest way for the layperson or a teacher perhaps, is to review the scientific literature, and that gives you a really good idea what the damaging effects of dams are and what a natural system undammed should resemble. There are very few rivers in the United States that haven't been tampered with in some fashion. So it's hard to find a relic or a reference reach that isn't totally impacted by man that you could compare your river to say, oh, it should look like that. So
Really, what the bottom line is that the biggest bang for your ecological restoration dollar is dam removal. You get the most benefit for the amount of dollars spent. So there are a lot of other ways to spend restoration dollars: connecting floodplains, removing culverts, which are essentially dams. But all the pieces that all those ecologically connected pieces that go along with dam removal give it that maximum benefit. By removing the dam, you're automatically reverting this cold water system to a cold water system. By having the dams in place, everyone thinks of them as green energy. They're not green energy. They're thermal pollutants. They segment the river system. We talked about the sediments that can't move actually through the system. In those sediments, the organics that are basically steroids, but they are the food for the entire resource. So by removing and you could follow this logic through papers, through science, through the folks that have been really pushing the study of geomorphology, which is basically the study of how rivers change over time. So I don't know if that answers your question.
I guess the dam came out, and you didn't just say, okay, river, here you go. Like, you did a lot of specific work to create certain things so that this river was functional. And what are some of those things that you did?
Okay, so what we're standing about 3.5 miles upstream from the actual where the dam was. And you see those, if you look out across the other side, you see those high banks?
Yeah.
So those high banks are the result of the dam 3 miles from here. Basically, you raise the water level up. Once you raise the water level up, you drop out all those first things that fall out of the heavier part of it, the big sands, the coarse sands. And then the organics stay in suspension a little bit longer. They wind up downstream. But as you do that, basically you're raising the bed of the stream with this sand over 90 years. What you're seeing over there, this is 3 miles from the dam, and that high bank over there, that's the result of that dam being in place and the sands falling out. So right where we were here, the river, the bottom of the river was actually about 2.5 feet higher, even more than that, right? 3 feet higher than it is right now. These gravels that have been exposed as part of the... So then you go back to thinking about removing the dam. When you do remove the dam, now you change that slope again. So we had dams up here, low slope, all these sediments fall in at the top end. You have a delta, just like going out into a lake. That delta filled in this entire upper impoundment with sand. If you would just remove the dam, blow it up with dynamite, basically the river is going to see the pattern and profile it had before the dam was built. It's the actual lowest point in the valley that has a substrate that will actually hold in place when the river flows through it. So what we did was this team decided, well, there are lots of ways to go about dam removal. Blow up a dam, you could actually come in and engineer structures, concrete, big rocks, wood. It's a little softer technique, but actually make the river flow where you wanted it to flow. What this team did, with the help of a company called Interflu, they're world-renowned geomorphologists, and their ideology, which was based on some things that came out of even folks in Michigan. A fellow named Joe Rathbun that worked for the DEQ had brought that, what we call is DOR, or depth of refusal measurement. So what we did was had this big open sandy delta. The team went through with what looks like a 1/2-inch chimney sweep rod, 20 feet tall, all graded at 1/10. It was graded in feet and then tenths of feet. And we did this as a team over about a month. And we did cross sections from valley wall, you can see valley wall there, basically to either valley wall or terrace. So we shoved that rod down through the ground. And we had a GPS along with us that was centimeter level accuracy, real-time kinetic GPS that was really accurate. So we'd take a shot right at the ground, and then we'd shove this, with usually 2 or 3 of us on the rod, push it down through, You'd hit something hard, kind of thumped. If it thumped, it was most likely, it would go in the notes as HFP, hard floodplain. There's something down there that was probably an old floodplain. And then you take the measurement on the rod, 8.7 feet goes into the notes. And then you do this, basically we did this every 12 feet. Laid this rod down across from valley wall to valley wall with about 150 cross sections from here 2.5 miles downstream. So we kept following these cross sections, and then you'd shove it down, boom, and you'd hit something that made a harder sound. And this rod has a metal tip, so you could actually feel something a little more substantial. W, wood. It was most likely wood, and you could tell wood after you got kind of worked into the process and get some experience with it. And then you'd hit something that sounded like tink, tink, tink. It was a rock. And once you knew that you found a rock, gravel, and it was the deepest spot in the valley, because now you're down, 7.2 feet, 9.2 feet, 10.5 feet wood. All of a sudden you're down at 12.2 feet and you're hitting something that sounds like rock. Most likely you're in the old river channel. So we were doing that through here as far as 13 feet deep, 13 feet down, tink, tink. All these cross sections get stitched together. They're all valley wall to valley wall. And then we take those cross sections and then we look down planimetrically. Instead of a cross section, we're looking down like this, and you start stitching together all those deepest parts in the valleys that actually had G for gravel in the notes. And as you stitch those together, the AutoCAD person, the geomorphologist, the team basically looks at it and says, well, this is our best guess at where the river was before the dam was in place. Whew, that's pretty exhausting. So why do we want to know why the river is why do we care where it is? We can just build the river up here and just put rocks and concrete, make it flow where we want. You could, but that has temporal restrictions. It's going to last 50, 100, 200. If you put the idea behind the whole process is, if you put the river back in its last pattern and profile, it's most likely to be the most stable pattern and profile. And that in turn, and here's the real kicker, the whole reason why, is not because we like old things and antiques, it's because if you put the river back where its last pattern and profile were, then you're managing the sediment that would move through the system in the most efficient manner. So the idea is so we have that planimetric shape that we just saw. We come back out in the field and we stake it. And we say to the excavators, well, this is most likely where the river is. We're not sure, but we're pretty close. So they dig down, and we had 4 excavators here, 5 months long, each of us standing in front of an excavator, digging down. The excavator would hit some gravel. You should see the expression on an excavator operator's face, be it male or female, and a big smile comes across their face when they pull up some gravel, and they're kind of calling from across the field saying, I got river here, I got river bottom, and we look at it, you could see they had some gravels. So as soon as they found gravel, the Bourbon River is so stable, 55 to 60 feet wide, all the way down through here, and it's at a pretty constant slope, 0.02% all the way down through here. So once they hit gravel, okay, we have the river. We don't know if we're in the center or not, so how do we find if we're in the center or not? They'd turn perpendicular to where the other stakes were, and they'd start digging towards the bank. And then, if they were lucky, they'd hit a stump just like that. If you see a stump like that growing at the edge of the river, you knew, okay, I got a bank, Even if you didn't hit a stump, because they always didn't, you'd wind up with cohesive bank material, that organic Lupton muck soils that exist here. So, black muck, okay, we know one bank. Turn around 180 degrees, start digging back the other direction, 55, 60 feet across. What do you know? They hit another stump. So after the river was defined in that section, remember there are 4 excavators doing this. Basically you start stitching sections together. And then once you pull all the sands out, so they're excavating the sands, And the permit said we have to place the sands above the 100-year floodplain so that if the water comes down through here, that sand would not be washed downstream. And why would we not want it to wash downstream? On the west coast, they blow up a dam and everything goes out the Pacific Ocean and everyone's happy. Here we have 142 residents downstream, and if that sand wasn't managed, if that sediment wasn't managed, it would work its way downstream. Sand kind of moves in slugs depending on drainage, rainfall, kind of moves in tongues of slugs. And what it would do is basically raise the riverbed. So if you let all this sand that was in this project, 250,000 cubic yards, that's enough to fill Ford Stadium 150 feet high. So kind of give you an idea how much sand was in here. So you remove that, you put it above the 100-year floodplain. Now the river can't bang back and forth, grab that sediment, move it downstream. Moves it downstream, it elevates the bed. Once you elevate the bed downstream, where's the water going to go? Out and up onto the floodplain, which works great if you don't have 142 residents and 4 or 5 bridges and all kinds of structures. So I always love the word flood. You know, everybody says that rivers flood. Rivers are designed to flood. It's the way they function. The only time we really call it a flood is when it affects something that we built too close to it. You know, that's when it becomes an issue. Nate, I've been talking.
Oh, I was just going to mention that the reason out west they can blow and go is because they have the terrain, elevation, drop, and they have the winter snowpack melts that flush that sediment out. In this part of Michigan especially, where we have a lot of sandy soils and rivers that are not flashy or flood tremendously at any level that would be capable of moving that sand downstream and out of the system. So what we're dealing with the sediment is actually legacy. A lot of it's legacy sediment from the logging days when the riparian zone was denuded, and actually from Lake Huron to Lake Michigan there wasn't a saleable stick of wood standing as a tree, and so that created a condition that rivers like the Boardman, where the banks would slump and become denuded with vegetation, and the sand would get in, and then the log drives also created a condition which, it exacerbated that condition. And just a note on that, as we go out into the basin, the former basin, you look up to the right, there's an overlook, and on that hill there was what was called a rollway, a high rollway, and there's a logging camp there at one time, and they used to deck the logs up on those high banks from farther in up country. They decked the logs there, and then in the spring when the water was running heavy, they would push the logs, sometimes using dynamite or oxen or what have you, and they push the logs over those banks and float them downstream. And that was a common practice in the upper Midwest, maybe in other places too, but Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin all had those rollways. The rollways themselves became denuded of any vegetation that would hold them together. So
some of them are still denuded.
Yes. Yep. And
hundreds of years later.
So what we're trying to do with managing the sediment up front is to not further exacerbate an issue that a lot of us as biologists are dealing with as part of our daily routine.
What kind of difference in temperature have you seen since you removed the impoundment to now? Like, how big's that temperature change?
Brownbridge was the biggest criminal out of all of them because it impounded the most acreage. It was just shy of 200 acres. And it was a top flow dam, which meant all the warm water on the top of the dam, on top of the pond, would flow over the top of the dam into the cold, what should have been cold river below. Well, we were getting temperatures of 80 degrees spilling over the top. And by the way, that violates Michigan DEQ water protection regulations. But that's such a common occurrence in this state that they can't, there's no teeth in those regulations.
It's a good example
all the grading done. The grading that existed in the system was eliminated because of the log.
So to answer your question, Kevin, once Brown Bridge was taken out, there was a 9-degree temperature drop in the river below, and we still have 2 dams to go, and we still had down at Boardman Lake, which is the very end of what you might term the upper river, maybe not middle river. I was seeing macro bugs that I'd never seen hatching down there. And that was, I believe, a response to the colder conditions.
That's a good point. So we've been doing some fishery surveys with the DNR, the tribe and the DNR, and Trout Unlimited also in this section. Typically, the status and trend sites, the ones that they do them for years, up at Ranch Rudolph and down below Brown Bridge. We actually added a couple of sites within the impoundment just to see what those populations were doing. And before the dam was removed, you'd see one in 5 brook trout to brown trout. 80% somewhere, 80% brown trout, 20% brook trout. In the last 6 years, and up through the last 3, it's been more 50-50. Brook trout, brown trout, brook trout are a lot less tolerant to lower quality water. It's all pretty high quality, but it is exceptional quality. If the brook trout, they like those highly oxygenated, colder habitat flows, and that's what we're seeing here.
So if you guys dug this out, what did this spot right here look like 10 years ago? Like when the dams were still in?
And underwater.
Yeah, we're still not really. You'll see as soon as the trees break away from us, you'll basically be able to see where the impoundment was. Right here, we're in the backwater, so basically the river was 3 or 4 feet higher. Everything here was just up.
And it barely moved. It wasn't flowing like this. It was almost like a skinny lake.
Yeah, this is the backwaters of the impoundment. Once you get down in there, you can actually see the tree line, and the bottom of the tree line across the whole lower section is basically that's where the impoundment was. So there are places that the whole river bed was 10 to 12 feet higher than it is now. So removed that many 12, 13 feet of sediment, removed it out of the river, placed it up on the spoil piles.
It's way up there. So I want to give the group a minute, if we can have maybe a couple of reactions or thoughts that you're having after hearing all of this, and then maybe we should get back going. And just so you know, I think both Frank and Nate will be at our luncheon, so you can continue the conversation there.
I did want to just real quick, the reason we stopped here, this is called the SEP, Supplemental Environmental Project. This was not part of the original project. The project started about 1,000 feet downstream. There was a lawsuit as a result of an October 6, 2012 dewatering incident where basically during dewatering that was permitted for 1 foot per day for 20 days, there was an issue with the design. The impoundment was emptied in about 8 hours. So there were several lawsuits. One of the lawsuits contributed money from the folks that were deemed responsible for an environmental project in the watershed. What you're standing on right here, this supplemental environmental project, everything you see was not here a year ago. What I'm standing on, so it looked pretty much like those banks, but higher. So we had what's called an incised channel. The river would never, even in its highest flood stage, could not get out. So basically what it would do is just bounce back and forth, beat up those banks, drop the sands, and move them downstream. This was the part above the project that we didn't have the funds for, and we didn't have the ability to actually get in the stream. You have to end the project somewhere. You can't always get everything you want. And the most important part that we thought at the time was dam removal. After we had that incident and the resulting funds from the lawsuits to be able to spend some money, the DEQ basically said you need to spend some. You have to put a certain money aside for a project. Then we brought the Department of Environmental Quality down here and we said, this is where we want to do the project. What we want to do is, there were 6 to 8 foot high banks. We wanted to pull back the banks and reconnect the river with the floodplain, because otherwise basically it would have just bounced back and forth in here for the next 50 or 60 years till it reconnected itself. The river bounced back and forth, it sloughs the bank. You start to build the floodplain. You can see it on that side, that small little bench there. You can start to see these little floodplains, those little terraces. You can actually see 1, 2, 3 of them there. Those start to develop as the river, as the bank sloughs. Warm water comes in, bank sloughs, some move, so it takes time. What this was designed by a fellow named Will Harmon, Stream Mechanics. This guy, Stream Mechanics, and the idea of this was, okay, we came in with excavators, and it was an amazing process. So this next quarter mile, when we're paddling down through here, everything you see here, like I said, this was not here we completed the project last September. There were high banks all the way through. So we came in with excavators, and the first excavator would pull all the sand back, throw it up onto that pile behind you, and we planted it with rye. That's why it all looks like there's a monocrop back there. So the sand winds up back there. Then they'd reach behind them, they'd grab these speckled alder that are in here, and any vegetation that was actually growing up on there, we'd cut the tops off of them. When you cut the tops off of something, where's all the energy go? Right to the roots, you know? So we'd take the tops, we'd store them out behind us. Excavator would come, grab a bucket full, and then we put in, if you can actually see, there's about 15 feet of speckled alder that were planted in here. So these were up there. We dug them out and then came through here, packed them in place, took the tops, laid them right at your feet. You can see them kind of protect the soil on that bank. So it's basically like creating instant bank with a connected floodplain. Now when the waters come up on the Boardman, if we have an inch or two of rain, we'll have a 12 to 14 inch rise. The water can access the floodplain. When the water can access the floodplain, it's not banging back and forth, bringing the sands and moving the excess sediments downstream. And more so, what you have is a functioning river. You have a river that's connected to its floodplain. All the energy dissipation that's going on in here, and all the critters, all those scrapers, all those insects that live up in here, versus the macroinvertebrates that are out, and that relationship comes back together. And just some days when we're out here, just amazingly proud. When I remember the first time we tried to snorkel down through this thing once or twice a summer, and to stand up and see basically to see dragonflies, odonata, everything's functioning. They're fighter pilots that exist on all those little organisms that live in the riparian zone. And if they're here, things are starting to work. So to me, the entire project, this is the icing on the cake for the project, and it was just took us about a month to do, and it was highly successful. So we're trying to take this technique and use it for the other dam projects.
Is this the only place where you've done that remediation? Is this spot for the Brown Bridge dam?
For the Brown Bridge phase. So what we did through permit down there was removed all the sand and then cut a floodplain in. So we did cut a floodplain 40 foot wide, so 20 feet each side, or sometimes it went from 40 to 0. So on the outside of the bends, right, you have no floodplain. On the inside of the bends, you have floodplain. It's the way rivers function. So as we went down through there, we cut out a floodplain. It was basically 20 feet on each side that kind of migrated back and forth depending on the curves of the river. By permit, we were required to plant and stabilize. Okay. So we used a bottomlands mix with 10 different varieties. Those seeds had to come from within 150 miles of where we're standing. And basically that's what we did through that whole stretch down there. This was a technique we actually found out about a little bit later in the process. Okay. It might not have worked so well in Brown Bridge because it was a lot of big sand. So we didn't have the tag alders. They're up here so that they were accessible for the project.
There was a tremendous seed bank in the sediment downstream as well. So the work that was done to reseed it was a supplement to what actually was already in there in the first place. So that was.
I think that was a project that one of the GPSI schools actually did, or at very least helped out with finding the seeds for the floodplain.
Oh, nice.
That was a project that school did.
Certainly a lesson learned that I hope we can continue is, if you leave things alone, sometimes it's better than trying to do something. Not as far as dams. Get the dams out of the way. That's the most important thing. Reconnect the floodplain. That's the second most important thing. But, people are certainly concerned with invasive species, and I think you'll hear a lot about that. But there's also the ability to give things a little bit of time before you just, what you're seeing behind you is some of those things are required by permit. You have to have vegetated banks so that the soil erosion control officers in your county government are satisfied that you're not going to have these eroding banks. And while I look at them and I see that it works, I think that if you just leave it alone, there's enough seed bank in that. And if you could get the soil erosion control officers to really understand and come out with you on a project and say, before we seed it, come on, give it a month. Because you're already seeing it at Boardman. I mean, 3 weeks ago they exposed soil and we're already seeing those natural seed banks popping. And I would much rather see that than an annual rye. These annual ryes are supposed to last a year or two and not come back. But they compete with all the natural vegetation here anyway. So, I mean, that would be a lesson. My personal peeve would be to wait and see what happens before you react sometimes.
A couple of reactions from you guys or things that are turning for you as you're hearing all this?
I'll have one. I live in Ottawa, and we have a river running through, and they put a lake between the river, and so we have to deal with every other year or so the constant sediment that's building up. You know, at one end, it's very, very shallow, and we have to dig it out and figure out where to put it, and if it's gotten, you know, pollutants in it, things like that. I think that
Was the lake created for recreational purposes?
it was created for beauty, and all the houses are around it now. And, yeah, so it's going to stay that way, but
Yeah, it
they
is.
have to consider what do you do with all that stuff every year, because it just looks nasty right here where all that sediment comes in.
She brought up a great point that we had to deal with, because all those sediments that fall out over the years, arsenic is naturally occurring, right? Right, and then you start dumping it in one place, and more in one place, and more in one place, and you could have a naturally occurring contaminant that winds up at elevated levels. So there's a DEQ comes through here. We are required to do all these test pits, monitor the levels, understand the levels that are in the sands, and then if they, whatever those levels wind up being, then there's certain criteria that you have to fill to make sure that you minimize public contact.
They put them in bio bags.
Yeah.
You know, they put all the sediment in a bio bag on the island. There's a little island in the middle of the lake.
Yeah.
And then they cut the bio bags and disperse the sediment as they had a chance to decompose and things like that.
Here,
Right on site.
So here, same thing. Nothing left site, except the contaminant levels weren't high enough to warrant separation exposure. So basically, what was happening was the sands were mixed in with the organics to create a 5 to 8% organic soil that'll actually seed pretty well. And then basically you seed it. There were a couple of places once you get to really elevated levels, they could require you to fence it off, make sure that people don't get into that area. It didn't happen here. It hasn't happened at all through the Boardman to the next phases, but if those contaminant levels are something that are on folks' minds. So we could actually, if you want, I know you're conscious of time, what we could do is we could talk about the large wood project of the next stop we would have made, and we can talk about it right now for 10 minutes and then just paddle on through. Projects that happen after the dam removal, the Conservation District continued with their planting efforts. In association with the Natural Resource Conservation Service, we have a liaison position that's paid by the Grand Traverse Band and the NRCS, and that fellow DJ Shook has been paramount in getting funds to continue the restorations here while the rest of the funds are used downstream. So the Conservation District, in conjunction with
Volunteers, our organization planted trees, and so did our church. Bethlehem Lutheran Church in Traverse City just planted 250 trees up here.
So perfect segue. I was saying the Conservation District, in conjunction with the volunteers, the Rotary District, churches, youth groups, you name it, have been out here. So I think we're up to 18,000 trees that have been planted within the project site. Pretty awesome. So the Conservation District, since this is basically city property, they kind of manage those plantings. But not only have we done the SEP, this Supplemental Environmental Project, all this tree planting, but what we're going to paddle through is called the Large Wood Project. So when you look around, you realize that it's going to be 40 or 50 years before a tree grows tall enough here to fall in the river. And especially in northern Michigan streams, trees that fall in rivers are absolutely essential to all the components that actually make the river function. We'll go so far to say that the Bourbon River, before the dams were built, most likely were not even single thread. In some places they were anastobrated streams, because there was so much wood. There were reports, early on reports from the logging days, that they didn't kind of come out here and cut. They actually, through the river, they actually had to cut their way upstream. There were places in the Bourbon where you could walk across it. All that wood drives the actual habitat and the substrated stream. That wood drives water beneath it. A tree falls in the water, lands adjacent to the stream or in the stream. The farther it lands in the stream, the more perpendicular to the flow, the more perturbation that tree exerts on the stream. It boosts oxygen at that point, right? It drives the water deep down beneath it to the hypereic zone, that zone between flowing water and groundwater. And it's critical. That exchange between groundwater and the hypereic zone is driven by wood, is paramount for some of the organisms that live in this stream. So that, because it'll be 40 or 50 years before we have that wood in the stream, and all those habitats that are associated with. So not only does it drive that hypereic zone, it also drives pool depth. You wind up with nice deep pools for some of the big fish. You wind up with habitat for the juveniles up in the branches. It's just, once you start really looking into the white papers on wood in streams, wood in streams is as important as the water in the streams. That maybe kind of sounding a little far-fetched, but not really. It's very important. So the idea is, come into the section of stream that it's going to be 40 or 50 years before we actually have some wood that falls in that creates those habitat situations. We'll build some. We had about $200,000 that was brought to this project by the NRCS. These large wood ELJs, engineered log jam, or large wood structures are built. They're engineered, and they have to be certified by an engineer. They're placed into the bank with as much wood out into the actual stream to create the perturbation and that exchange between the wood and the actual stream. And I lost the train of thought. So we actually had this design team come out here, design these structures, and we put 23 structures in. And I think most of the silt fence has been ripped out from behind them, so some of them you might think they're natural. You may not. I'm hoping that you don't think that they look natural to you. But these are basically put in so that it gives us at least a step ahead for the habitat through what's relatively barren for habitat. It's open to the sun. We don't have any shade. We don't have anything that actually drives those scour in the pools. So, Nate, did you want to say something about wood?
Yeah, I was just picking this up. If you're in a creek or a river, pick up a piece of wood and look at what's crawling all over it. If you're in a sandbed stream that doesn't have a lot of gravel, and it's just sand, wood's going to be the only place those organisms can colonize. And that goes for the paraphyte, the bacteria and the algae that grow on there and give it that slimy feel. That's what the bugs are eating, and the fish are eating the bugs. And wood is not only important for fish, but you see a lot of turtles basking on logs. You see birds like kingfisher or spotted sandpiper, even regular old mallards. You can see them hanging out on pieces of wood in the river. And I've actually seen, since the jams were installed, mink have been hanging out a lot on those jams. No otter yet. So wood's important for a lot of things. And going back to the logging days, the wood was pulled pulled out of the river so they could push their logs down. They were actually on the Manistee River south of here. There was a company called the Manistee River Improvement Company. They hired surveyors to go out into the Manistee before it was opened up for settlement and map all the log jams that existed on the Manistee. And they found that there were game trails on these log jams that were so extensive and had been there so long. And there were also trees growing out of the log jams as well. So that's the condition. You know, as much as many of us would like to go back to that condition in at least a few areas, regulatory agencies aren't going to let us do that. So.
Yeah, one of the really it's the issues that we actually dealt with when you see these structures that came past, when these were designed, we were trying to convince the regulator, we totally understand where the regulator's position. They need to make sure that whatever you put in the river or alongside of it is safe for people to paddle past. That is going to, there's number one, safe for people to paddle past. Number two, does not raise the stage or level of the river to where it would flood more frequently if there are related infrastructure that could be affected by that flooding. But that piece isn't in there so easy for them. We could say there's no one that lives up here. Our first structures were including 60 to 80% of the river, and there was just absolutely no way that was going to happen. We wound up with 25%. 25% of 60. So we wound up with, you know, somewhere between 12 and 15 feet channel occlusion, right? So we actually came down here and measured log jams, and there's an exponential function from, if you go from 25% occlusion, so let's say you go to from a 15 foot wide occlusion with branches in here, and the associated habitat that's right next to it, the pool that's actually scoured from the result of that, the sands that are, because it actually, what it actually does is sort the substrate. You wind up with that same sorting that happens with the dam. You have the fines just on the uphill side, on the upstream side. You have scour. At the bottom of the scour, you have the coarser components of the substrate, because as you scour and as the weight of the water pushes down on it, those shear stresses create the forces that move smaller particles, so you have coarser particles down there. That difference, that heterogeneity, that difference between the substrates from upstream to downstream and through the whole jam, including the length and depth of the pool. And back to that exponential piece, is when you go from 15% to 40%, you wind up with 3 times the benefits in that additional, from 25 to 40%. And that extra 15% occlusion, you actually wind up with 3 times the benefits because of that extended occlusion. But what we decided to do on this was, it was such a difficult process. The DEQ is set up for, the regulations are set up for people that are building infrastructure, strip malls, things that actually affect the quality of the environment they're trying to protect. They're not quite set up as well for beneficial ecological projects. Their regulations need to be tweaked, and they're working on it really hard. There's a great group of individuals at the DEQ that are working on this. So the large wood project that we're going to actually float through here, we wound up with a 25% occlusion, and what we said was, let's build it this way. We'll monitor the effects, and then so we did the upper third of the impoundment. So there'll be 2 more subsequent projects, we hope, and hopefully we can build on it. Maybe next time it's 40% occlusion, next time it's 50% occlusion. As long as they're built in a way that it doesn't suck in paddlers and push people underneath them, because that's what they're concerned with, then I think we'll continue to get those benefits. Anyway.
This is amazing. We have to go.
Thank you guys, thank you.
So we good? So we're going to just paddle on down through to right where we started this morning. And so